At the end of the 1980s, I had another long sabbatical. If you work at the university, we all know the problem of getting sabbaticals, but I could leave for another year. So I was thinking, what will I do now? And first I looked at Yemen, but I had a little daughter of 4, and I wanted to take her with me, and the child's health situation is very, very bad there. So I switched to Jordan, because Jordan had received very few anthropologists, and I liked that. I thought it's new and should be a good country. So I arranged with Yarmouk University in Irbid that I would teach on Sundays, and through someone working at the university, I could find a home. I could stay in a small town, Hossa, nearby, south of Irbid, and I could live there and take that little town, or yeah, nowadays it's more like a village, as the community I would study. So I went there thinking that I might take the women without men as an interesting comparison topic with me, and then it turned out that a lot of widows in Jordan had a pension from the state and lived a very sober and secluded life, and were not the interesting types that I met in Algeria. But I discovered at Yarmouk University, that in the anthropology department, the head of the department was a woman, a lot of the staff was female, and a large number of students too. And this was a very big surprise, because in the Netherlands I was, at that time, I think, the only woman in a department. So I thought, so why not do education and the history of women's education. So I started doing the history of women's education, and came upon some problems because how to find out why, and no, let me say it this way. I decided to write and compare the Dutch situation with the Jordanian situation, because the Dutch have this idea, well, education is nothing for Arab women, and they look down upon the educational systems of the Arab world. And here I was, and I arrived, and they say, well, don't you have Word on your computer? Give it to me, I'll install it. So they were very much advanced computer-wise, and in women at education and at the university. So I compared it, and I wondered how come that in Jordan I saw such a positive picture. And it had to do with a lot of, it was of course very complex, as we usually discover in anthropology, and it had to do with the cultural valuation of thaqafa, of being cultured, which was very strong. It had to do with the Palestinian refugees, and like in the Jewish diaspora, education is the best thing to bring if you have to flee or go somewhere. And so the Palestinians were far more educated than the Bedouin, the original Bedouins of Jordan. And they set up an educational system with this reservation that they occupied all kinds of important positions in schools and universities and at the Ministry of Education, except for the Minister of Education, because he was always a Muslim and a non-Palestinian and a non-Christian. Yeah, a non-Christian, because a lot of the Palestinians were also Christian. But that's another story. To come back on why women so much, because culture was so much valued, large famous families would have even make their own study funds for students to go abroad. But you can imagine that those students were mainly boys. So the boys went abroad and the girls stayed at home, which also changed the figures, the gender figures of students in education. And was there another reason? Oh yeah, another reason was the Christian mission. And the Christian mission was very maybe this was influenced by the fact that I was based in Hussen, which was half Muslim, half Christian. And I remember going to the Ministry of Education to find the figures, the historical figures on education. And I found that in Hussen, a secondary school was established years before the primary school. So this was quite strange, because how could you have a secondary school and not a primary school? And then when in the village, in the town, I went and visited all the different schools, I started to understand why, because the most famous or the best known Christian school was the School of the Rosary, of the Sisters of the Rosary. And it was considered a private school now, and they were established far before the first state school, but because the ministry only gave the state figures and not the private and the missionary figures, they did not include these schools. And the missions, they are not that many Christians in Jordan, so they were based in specific towns and villages. And in Hussen, they were originally the Greek Orthodox, but a lot of missionaries went to the Holy Land, to Palestine, but there were too many missionaries. So, and also the tribes on the Jordanian side used it because when they were having conflicts, they looked for their own priest or their own missionary. So they went to Palestine and brought back their own priest. So before long, there were, I think, 7 different Christian denominations in the village, and all these Christian denominations wanted to attract believers from the original Greek Orthodox, because, you know, the Muslims were considered unconvertible. So there was a large competition, and what do you compete with? Schooling was an important way of competing. So there were several Christian schools that, you know, if one didn't have money, the other one would provide for them, and so on. But this resulted in the fact that everyone who wanted to go to school could go to school, but also that they were eager to have the girls, because in their perception it's better to teach the girl, because the girl will be mother of the family and she will, you know, expand the belief and the religious views. So there was both a focus on girls and an opportunity for girls to go to school. Even Muslim girls would go to school because there were no efforts to convert people. But in this competition, of course, girls profited to go to school and then continue. The Christians also provided sometimes scholarships even to go and to Beirut, but later on they had their own universities in Jordan, and this also led to increase the opportunity of schooling for girls. And the second time I came, a few years later, I came to Jordan, and then my host family picked me up from the airport, and the small girls had grown up, and they were now teens, and they very excitingly pointed out all the new buildings on the roadside. This is a new university, and this is another new university, and that's the one I'm going to. And I was very much surprised, because all these universities were private universities. So for my next article, I decided I will look into this privatization of universities and what effect that has for the education of girls. And it turned out that providing higher education had become a big business. Beirut had fulfilled that function a long time, but because of the wars, the whole Middle East didn't want to go to Beirut anymore for their education. So in Jordan they saw an opportunity, and they built all these new universities. And these new universities expanded the possibilities for education, because first the state universities could ask for high entrance grades. So they the education was free, but you could only enter with the highest grade. So they had a very strict, apart from the corruption that there was also there, but officially they had a very strict selection system. And now you had these rich families with less gifted daughters and sons that could not enter state university had an opportunity to go to the private universities. And also what you see that originally some of the private universities had been Christian, although they're not named Christian anymore. But strangely enough, I could figure out, do they have a swimming pool or not? It was how you could see that they were Christian. But the Muslim, different Muslim groups also started to have their own private universities, and they also here new competition, so new opportunities for women, because they advertised in order to convince also conservative parents, don't worry about that she won't stay a modest Muslim girl, because we will provide transportation. We have all female-run boarding houses, etc. And we will take care of the proper behavior of your daughter. So that was the education topic. And the shifting of topics made me think of the concept of serendipity. And I always like this concept because it's very, Horace Walpole introduced it again in the 18th century on the story of the three princes of Serendip. And they saw a camel on the roadside, and from just close observation of all the details, and here comes in anthropology, close observation of a certain detail, you try to deduce all kinds of information about, in that case, the camel, but in our anthropologist's view, whatever you find, you are finding new topics. And strangely enough, serendipity is often described as having luck and seeing suddenly things that you did not expect to see. And I think it's not just mere luck, because I think you can train it. For instance, in funding, at a certain moment I was lucky to have to be able to get some research funding, and one colleague remarked, you're always lucky in getting funds. I said, I'm not always lucky. I have 10% chance, just like you, which means that if I want one, then I have to put in 10 proposals, which I do, and I work very hard to make them the best proposal I can make them in order to get the funds. And it also helps, like the Princes of Serendip did, to look into other directions, to take a detail and try to connect it with something else that you did not expect before. So this means at that time I was already at this interdisciplinary institute, and in this interdisciplinary institute we always said, well, what is required for interdisciplinary work is very stubborn disciplinary specialists who are able to defend their own specialty to others who are out of the discipline. And but if you think out of the discipline and you listen to other people from other disciplines, you can make connections that are not at first sight logical or at first sight standard in your field, and thus find some new hypothesis to think about, or new ways to look at things or to see things. And so my own example is how by serendipity I came to change topics all the time, and there's another change coming along, because when I visited these schools, someone handed me a biography of Sir Marie Alphonsine, and she was the founder of the order who started the school. And well, what do? I wasn't particularly interested in religion or historical biography of a sister, so I put it aside and only read it much later when I returned another time to the field, and I thought, well, these Sisters of the Rosary, they have done a lot for education in the Middle East. Let me have a look at this biography. And then it turned out it was a nun. She was a member of a French order, but asked the Pope to be relieved of this and to be able to found her own order, the Sisters of the Rosary, and with a special task. First, they should all be Arab sisters, so it was an all regional congregation. And secondly, their main aim was to bring education to the girls and women of the Middle East. And actually that's what they did. I mean, they spread all over the Middle East and founded schools and primary, secondary, and even one university, not only in Jordan but in all different, in Beirut, I think they are, but also in other Middle Eastern countries. And this was remarkable, because this brought me, Sir Marie Alphonsine was said to have visions of Mary telling her to do this. And this brought me to, on the one hand, a comparison of 3 Middle Eastern Christian visionaries, and again this same question: what do they do with their visions in order to change or negotiate the position of women? Because actually what she wanted is, she wanted an autonomous order. She went against the rule of the congregation she was a member of. She wanted her an autonomous order, and not only that, she went against the whole ideology of women having to stay at home and be proper housewife, etc. I mean, they were going to educate women, and of course they preached the ideology that the best place of a woman was in the home, but at the same time, because they spread schools all over the different villages, they needed teachers. So actually what they did is they trained the teachers for their own schools and opened up opportunities for girls to become a teacher. And to become autonomous even. I mean, I know one 16-year-old girl being chaperoned by her 17-year-old sister in going on a mule's back hours away to another village and living there in order to run a school. And it's amazing what they had to do in that time. And it's also amazing how they enabled women to step out of the traditional norms without saying they did, but actually in practice they performed this function. And from thinking about women in education, of course, I also came to women anthropologists in the field and wondering why so many women anthropologists are being forgotten, and especially in the Middle East and North Africa, we have some French ethnographers who just did not make it, although I think they wrote beautiful books like Mattea Gaudry and what's her first name, Guachon. And Guachon worked both in Algeria and in Jordan. And Hilma Granqvist, who worked in Palestine, and it was for a conference on Hilma Granqvist that I worked out this idea, why are these women more or less forgotten? And it's interesting to see, because they were ethnographers in the sense that they entered houses, they could observe and see a lot of things, but they were in a tradition of writing down every detail, every song, every craft, every custom, and the result was an encyclopedic volume. And actually that's also what its value is the value as an encyclopedia of a specific community. And the problem was that they wrote in French, and here of course you have a problem too. You have a problem too, I think, as Canadians. The world is divided between the French-speaking community and the English-speaking community, and somehow there's a barrier between them. There's very little communication, and very few people in America read French, unless it's Foucault who is being translated, or some people, but they are translated, but somehow there's very little contact. And the exception, of course, is Germaine Tillon, who worked in Algeria, but she worked with Thérèse Rivière, and Thérèse Rivière actually did most of the work, if I'm saying a little bit disrespectful, because she was the photographer, and Germaine Tillon went with her, I think, when still a student. And but Thérèse Rivière unfortunately ended up in a mental asylum, so could not really do things with her. But it's sad to see a little bit that their work was done together, and all the honor goes to Germaine Tillon at the end. Even when there's an exposition of the photographs of Rivière, she's mentioned, but it's more or less the work of Tillon. And why is Tillon so famous? Because first she got translated into English. There was a biography written about her by Nancy Wood in English, and then translated back into French. But also because she had a revolutionary theory, or a general theory explaining the suppression of women because of the marriage system, and the efforts of cousins to keep the land into their hands, and thus requiring women to be both veiled and not being offered to other men, and marry their cousins so that the land could stay in the family. So if you have grand theories, you survive, but I think you survive for a while, because they go out of fashion at a certain moment, and then people can go back to these old ethnographies that are full of details, and that you can use as a basis for a lot of new theories, if you would want that. And I think they shouldn't be forgotten, but they should be sort of recognized, their value in their own worth and with what they did. Another form of serendipity, again going back on women in women in education, is women in education and the status of women in the Dutch educational system. And I had there was a PhD student, Marieke van den Brink, and who is now my successor at the Institute for Gender Studies, which has now changed its name to Gender and Diversity. But she did a very interesting study on the selection procedures for professors at the Dutch universities. And actually, she was very detailed and very profound, because she took, for a certain period of time, all the application procedures, and she managed to get permission from the universities to look into them. And the idea was, why is the Netherlands doing so badly on international statistics on women in academia, and especially women in the higher levels of academia? and we wrote together an article on the transparency, which is one of the reasons, the lack of transparency, is because you see that there's a difference between disciplines, and especially in some disciplines, there's a lack of transparency in the sense that they say that officially the procedure is open, it's advertised widely, everyone can apply, etc. And it's transparent. They have to write a report of who applied and who is being proposed and all that. But in reality, she found that when you ask people of this is what they normally say, how do application procedures go or selection procedures go? But when you ask for the last procedure, it's always different, because no, we knew that guy and he was very good, so we really had to run and try to get him. And in that case, you just don't get the women, because it's her argument is that if you keep it open and transparent, women have more chance. It's not automatically that they become it, but they have more chance. And the same, and she discovered all kinds of myths, you know, the myth of publication. The number of publication is the guiding, and the number of citations is the guiding measure of who is, who comes up. Well, actually, it does. If you among men, it does. Then it does. But if you compare men with women, it does not, because then it works against you to have a lot of publications. That does not really help you that much. And so, the idea of how is quality measured, what is expected of a person. All kinds of notions about who can be a boss and who can, handle this chaotic department. Then automatically all kinds of gender notions are intervening, but they're not mentioned or not officially. They don't have an official status, but in the end, they have the result that far less women are appointed than should be appointed on the basis of the number of publications or citations that they have. So that was a totally, and then I also have this article on where I compared the Dutch situation with Albania. Even Albania does a little bit better than the Netherlands, but I won't bother you with that. Okay.